For 30 years, I gave that house my mornings, my hands, and the quiet parts of my heart. Then one night, he put my life in a suitcase and told me I had nowhere to go.
At 64 years old, Helen Brooks learned she was homeless from the man she had cooked for, cared for, and stayed loyal to for 30 years. Frank did not yell. He did something colder. He placed one suitcase by the front door, handed her divorce papers, and told her to sign before Friday. The house was his, the bank accounts were his. Even the car in the driveway, he said, was his. Then he looked at the woman who had given him half her life and said, "You have nowhere else to go." But Frank made one mistake. He forgot about the old key in Helen's purse, a key from Grandma Alma, a key to a cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a cabin Helen had been told was sold years ago. That night, with rain crawling down the windshield, Helen drove away from Asheville with shaking hands and one suitcase. She thought she was driving toward an empty, rotting cabin. But Frank had just sent her straight to the place he never wanted her to open, because inside that cabin, behind dust, quilts, and one locked drawer, Helen was about to find her name on everything. And if you believe people like Helen should not be erased in silence, subscribe now. Don't just watch her comeback, stand witness to it. But Helen's story did not begin with the suitcase. It began long before Frank placed it by the front door, long before he handed her papers with yellow tabs, long before he looked at the woman who had carried his life for 30 years and called her unreasonable. The house had been forgetting Helen in small ways first. A bill placed in Frank's drawer instead of hers, a bank statement folded before she could read it, a family decision made while she stood at the sink with dishwater cooling around her hands, a dinner guest praising Frank for the beautiful home, while Helen stood in the kitchen wiping gravy from the stove. Nobody noticed those little disappearances. Not at first, not even Helen. She had been raised to keep peace, to make do, to lower her voice when a man raised his pride, and for years she told herself that marriage was not about credit, it was about loyalty. So she stayed loyal. She stayed through Frank's cold silences, through the way he corrected her in front of neighbors with a smile, through the way he handled every account, every title, every official paper, then made her feel childish for asking questions. She stayed when his children needed rides, meals, clean clothes, and someone steady to wait up at night. She stayed when Frank's father got sick and the house began to smell of medicine, soup, and old blankets. Helen fed that old man when his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. Frank thanked the doctor, not her. That was how it happened, not in one cruel moment, piece by piece, until Helen could walk through the living room and see her whole life there, but almost none of her name. The blue chair by the fireplace still carried the shape of Frank's father. The rug under the coffee table still held a pale stain from spilled grape juice, scrubbed thin by Helen's hands. The hallway wall still carried framed family photos, Frank in front, his children close, Helen near the edge, always near the edge. On the night he told her to leave, she finally saw it. She had not been standing beside her life. She had been pushed to the margin of it. Frank stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, calm enough to seem innocent. That was one of his gifts. He could wound a person without looking angry. The folder lay on the entry table. Helen looked at the printed name on the top page, Helen Marie Brooks. For a strange second, seeing her full name startled her. There it was, clean, black, official, the same name Frank had spent years making smaller in every room they shared. He nodded toward the papers. "It's better if we keep this clean, clean, as if Helen were a stain, as if 30 years could be wiped away without leaving a mark." She did not answer. That silence unsettled him. Frank stepped closer, lowering his voice the way he always did when he wanted control to sound like CERN. "At our age, Helen, there's no need for drama. Sign before Friday. Let's not make this harder. Helen almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because she suddenly understood that Frank had mistaken her patience for permission. Her eyes moved to her purse on the small table beside the door. Inside it was her wallet, a handkerchief, 2 peppermints wrapped in plastic, and an old brass key she had carried for decades without thinking much about it. Grandma Alma's key. Helen had nearly forgotten its weight, but now she felt it from across the room. Frank opened the front door. Cold mountain air slipped into the house. The porch light flickered once above the steps. Helen lifted the suitcase. It felt too light for 30 years. Frank watched her, waiting for tears, excuses, pleading some final proof that he still had the larger shadow. But Helen only looked at him. Then she stepped outside. Behind her, his voice followed. "You don't have anywhere else to go." Helen stopped on the porch. For one breath, she almost believed him. Then the brass key shifted inside her purse, a tiny sound, metal against metal. Small enough for Frank to miss, strong enough for Helen to hear. She walked to the car and shut the door. The house remained behind her, bright in every window, like it had never needed her at all. But as Helen backed out of the driveway and turned toward the dark Blue Ridge Road, one thought rose through the shock. Frank had taken the house with his name on it, but he had forgotten the key to the place where hers might still be waiting, and by morning, that forgotten key would open more than a door. The road to Grandma Alma's cabin felt narrower than Helen remembered, or maybe Helen was the one who had been made smaller. The headlights cut through the rain outside Asheville, sliding over wet pavement, bare trees, and the low mountain mist that gathered after dark. Helen drove with both hands on the wheel. Slow, careful. Not because the road frightened her, because every mile carried her farther from Frank's house and closer to a place everyone claimed no longer existed. The brass key sat in the cup holder. She had taken it from her purse at the first stoplight. For years it had been only a keepsake, a dull old key on a faded ring. Something she carried because throwing it away felt like disrespecting the only woman who ever made her feel safe. But tonight, under the weak dashboard light, the key looked less like memory and more like instruction. Grandma Alma had given it to Helen in June of 1982. Helen was 22 then. She sat at Alma's kitchen table in Black Mountain, eating peach cobbler from a chipped white bowl while warm air moved through the screen door. Alma had been rolling dough. Strong hands, flour on her wrists, a blue apron tied tight around her waist. Without warning, she reached into her pocket and placed the key in Helen's palm. "A woman should always know where her own key is," Alma said. Helen laughed back then. She thought it was one of Alma's old-fashioned sayings. She did not hear the warning underneath. But Alma had already started watching Frank, not in a loud way. Alma was too careful for that. She watched how Frank answered questions meant for Helen, how Helen looked at him before giving her own opinion, how his smile stayed gentle in public while Helen grew quieter beside him. Once, after Sunday dinner, Alma touched Helen's wrist and spoke so low no one else could hear. "Some men don't take everything at once, baby. They make you hand it over piece by piece." Helen remembered pulling her hand away, not because Alma hurt her, because the truth did. She loved Frank then. She wanted Alma to be wrong. Years later, after Alma died, the family said the cabin was sold. Too old, too expensive, too much trouble. Frank had barely looked up when Helen asked about it. "Probably for the best," he said. That place was never worth anything. But now Helen was driving toward it with his divorce papers on the passenger seat and Alma's key beside her. The road curved upward. Rain tapped the windshield. The woods thickened until the trees looked like they were leaning in to listen. Then Helen saw it, a rusted mailbox, no name on it. Just a dented black box near a split-rail fence swallowed by weeds. Her foot eased off the gas. The cabin road was still there, 2 muddy tracks disappearing into the trees. Helen stopped at the entrance. Her breathing sounded too loud in the car. If the cabin was gone, Frank was right. If the key failed, everyone had told the truth. But if the key worked, then somebody had lied to her for years. Helen turned down the dirt road. The tires pressed through wet leaves and gravel. At the bend, the cabin appeared. Small porch, dark roof. One front window catching her headlights like an eye. She parked and sat still. No porch light, no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life, only rain and the soft ticking of the engine cooling. Helen climbed the steps. The boards groaned beneath her shoes. At the door, she pushed the brass key into the lock. It fit. Her hand trembled. She turned it. The lock clicked open. But before Helen touched the knob, she saw fresh scratches around the keyhole. Someone had been there before her, recently. The scratches around the lock were thin, but new. Helen could see them in the wash of her headlights. Bright lines cut into old brass. Someone had pushed a key there, or maybe a tool, recently enough that the exposed metal had not darkened. Helen stood on the porch with one hand on the knob and the other wrapped around Grandma Alma's key. Rain tapped the roof above her, soft, steady, almost patient. For one moment she thought about turning around, getting back in the car, finding a motel near Asheville, calling somebody who might tell her she was not foolish for being afraid. But the names that came to mind did not comfort her. Frank had thrown her out. Her relatives had told her this cabin was gone, and the only person Helen wanted to call had been buried for years. So she turned the knob. The door opened with a tired creak. Cold air moved out of the cabin, as if the little house had been holding its breath. Helen stepped inside. The smell came first: dust, old wood, damp stone, and underneath it all, the faint cedar scent of Grandma Alma's storage chest. Helen reached for the switch at the door. Nothing happened. The power was off. She raised the flashlight on her phone. A narrow beam cut across the room. The cabin was smaller than memory had kept it, but it was not ruined. That was the first strange thing. The sofa was covered with a sheet. The kitchen table had been pushed neatly against the wall. A tin bucket sat beneath a slow leak in the ceiling. Someone had placed it there, not decades ago, not by accident. Helen moved carefully over the floorboards. They groaned beneath her shoes, but held. Her light passed over the fireplace. Cold ashes sat inside, old ashes, but not old enough to belong to Alma. Helen stopped breathing for a second. Someone had been in this cabin, maybe not that night, maybe not even that week, but recently enough to keep it standing, recently enough to leave marks on the lock. Her phone buzzed. Frank. His name glowed on the screen. Helen stared at it in the dark room, listening to the rain and the pulse in her ears. She did not answer. A text appeared. "Don't make this difficult. Sign the papers tomorrow." Helen's fingers tightened around the phone. For 30 years, Frank had used calm words like ropes, clean, reasonable, difficult. Words meant to make her feel ashamed for resisting. But here, in Alma's cabin, they sounded different, smaller. Helen turned the phone face down on the kitchen table. Then she saw the bedroom door at the back, half open, waiting. She walked toward it with her flashlight raised. The room was narrow and still. An iron bed stood against the wall. A cedar chest sat beneath the window, and folded across the foot of the bed was Alma's quilt. Helen knew it at once. Blue squares, white stitching, tiny yellow flowers along the border. Alma had sewn it during the winter Helen turned 20. Back then, Helen had begged to help. Alma let her stitch 3 crooked flowers, then laughed and said crooked things could still be loved if they held together. Helen sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sighed under her weight. For the first time since leaving Frank's house, her body admitted how tired it was. Her feet ached, her shoulders burned, her throat felt tight from all the words she had swallowed. She touched the quilt with both hands. The fabric was old but carefully kept, not displayed, not forgotten, kept. Helen pulled it closer. That was when her thumb brushed something raised beneath the stitching. She leaned in. At first, she thought it was part of the flower pattern. Then she saw the letters, small, careful, almost hidden in the border. HB. Helen touched them with 2 fingers. Her initials, sewn where no stranger would notice, but where she would. A sound left her then. Not quite a sob. Not quite a breath. For years, Frank had made her feel like her name belonged only on forms he controlled, but Alma had stitched it into warmth, into shelter, into something made by hand. Helen turned the quilt over. Along the underside, one row of thread looked different from the rest, newer, tighter, intentional. A narrow pocket had been sewn into the backing. Helen found a loose pin on the bedside table and worked the thread carefully. One stitch, then another. The pocket opened. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed but clean. On the front, in Alma's handwriting, were the words, "For Helen Brooks, when she finally comes back." Helen sat completely still. The cabin seemed to quiet around her. Even the rain felt farther away. She broke the seal. A small brass key slipped into her palm. Then came a folded letter. Only one line was written at the top. "Before you sign anything, open the bottom drawer of my writing desk." Helen lifted her eyes. Across the dark room near the far wall stood Grandma Alma's old writing desk. And for the first time that night, Helen wondered whether Frank had scratched the lock because he had come looking for that drawer too. Helen did not move toward the desk right away. The letter stayed open in her lap. The small brass key rested in her palm, colder than the room around her. Across the bedroom, Grandma Alma's old writing desk stood against the wall, half covered in shadow. Helen remembered that desk, dark walnut, 3 drawers on each side, 1 long drawer across the middle. Alma used to sit there on Sunday evenings with a cup of black coffee, writing checks, folding letters, and keeping papers in careful stacks. Helen had never thought much about it then. To a young woman, papers were boring, bills were boring, property lines were boring. But now, at 64 years old, with Frank's divorce folder sitting in her car outside, Helen understood that boring papers could decide whether a woman slept under a roof or under regret. She stood slowly. The floorboards creaked beneath her shoes. Every sound felt too loud. The rain had softened outside, but the cabin still seemed to listen. Helen crossed the room and knelt in front of the desk. The bottom drawer had a small lock, brass, tarnished, scratched around the edge. Her throat tightened. More scratches. Not as fresh as the ones on the front door, but enough to make her wonder who had tried this drawer before her. She slipped Alma's key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Helen turned it gently. The lock resisted. She closed her eyes. "Please," she whispered. The key shifted, then clicked. The drawer opened a few inches. Helen sat back on her heels. Inside were folders wrapped in faded string, a small brown ledger, several envelopes, and a thin stack of papers inside a plastic sleeve protected from dust and damp. On top was another note. Only 6 words. "Read slowly. Trust the dates first." Helen frowned. Trust the dates? She lifted the plastic sleeve and pulled out the first page. The legal words blurred at first. Parcel. Transfer. Beneficiary. County register. She almost put it down. Frank's voice came back to her. "You never liked paperwork, Helen." He had said it so many times that she had started believing it was part of her personality. But it was not. It was something he planted. So she forced herself to read again, line by line, slowly. Then she saw it. Her name, Helen Marie Brooks, typed in the middle of the page. Not written by Alma, not tucked inside a private letter. Printed on a recorded deed. Helen's hand covered her mouth. She read the sentence again, then again. The cabin property had been transferred into a protected arrangement years earlier, and Helen was named. Her name was connected to the place beneath her feet. Not Frank's, not a cousin's, not some buyer the family had invented. Hers. The room seemed to tilt. For one strange second, Helen looked down at the floorboards as if they might answer her. All those years believing the cabin was gone, and her name had been sitting in this drawer, waiting in ink. She found tax receipts next, old ones, newer ones, Buncombe County, parcel numbers, payments made through an account Helen did not recognize. Some had Alma's name, some reference to trust. One paper was dated only 8 months earlier. Helen froze. 8 months. Alma had been gone for years. So who had kept paying? Who had kept the cabin standing? And why had nobody told Helen? Her phone buzzed again from the kitchen table. The sound cut through the cabin like a blade. Helen did not want to look, but she already knew. Frank. She walked back to the kitchen, still holding the deed. The screen glowed with another message. "I spoke to my attorney. You need to stop dragging this out." Helen stared at those words. Then she looked down at the deed in her hand. For the first time that night, Frank's urgency no longer felt like impatience. It felt like fear. Helen did not answer him. She opened the divorce folder she had brought from the car and laid Frank's papers beside Alma's documents on the table. 2 sets of papers. 2 different worlds, one trying to erase her, one trying to restore her. She scanned the first page Frank had marked with a yellow tab. The language was thick and cold. Waiver, release, known and unknown claims, separate property, inheritance. Helen did not understand enough to know what it all meant. But she understood one thing. Frank had wanted her signature before she opened that drawer. She carefully gathered Alma's papers, the deed, the tax receipts, the ledger, the note about the dates. Then she placed them inside an old flour tin from the pantry, the way Alma used to hide cash from summer storms and nosy visitors. Helen did not sleep after that. She sat at the kitchen table until the gray light of morning began to press against the windows. The cabin looked different in daylight. Not safe yet, but real. Real enough to fight for. At 8:17 a.m., Helen found a name written on the back of one envelope. Price and Low Attorneys, Black Mountain, North Carolina. Beneath it, Alma had written one instruction. Ask for Daniel. Bring both folders. Helen held the envelope in both hands because Grandma Alma had not only left her proof, she had left her a witness, and somewhere in town, someone else knew why Helen's name was on that deed. Helen drove into Black Mountain with both folders on the passenger's seat. Frank's folder sat on top, yellow tabs, smooth paper, everything arranged to make surrender look simple. Alma's folders sat beneath it, older, worn at the corners, tied with faded string. Helen kept glancing at them as the road curved past small shops, brick sidewalks, and early morning traffic moving through town like nothing had happened. That bothered her more than she expected. The world had not paused. People were buying coffee. A man was walking a brown dog near the hardware store. Two women stood outside a bakery, laughing into the cold morning air. And Helen was driving with proof in her passenger seat that her life might have been built on a lie. She parked outside Price and Low Attorneys at 9:06 a.m. The office sat in a narrow red brick building with white trim and a brass sign by the door. Not fancy, not intimidating. Just old enough to look like it had heard more secrets than it ever repeated. Helen sat in the car for a moment. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. She almost turned around. Frank's voice came back. Lawyers make things ugly. Lawyers take your money. Lawyers drag out pain. But Grandma Alma's note had not said ask Frank. It had said ask for Daniel. So Helen picked up both folders and went inside. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile. Do you have an appointment? Helen's throat felt dry. No, she said, but I need to ask for Daniel. The woman's smile changed slightly. Daniel Price? Helen nodded and opened Alma's envelope. My grandmother told me to bring this. The receptionist looked at the handwriting. Then she stood, quickly but with care. Please sit down, Mrs. Brooks. Helen had not heard anyone say her name with that much respect in a long time. 10 minutes later, an older man stepped into the waiting room, tall, thin. Gray hair combed back, a navy sweater under his jacket. He looked at Helen first, then at the envelope in her hands, and something moved across his face. Recognition, not of Helen, of Alma. You're Helen, he said softly. Helen stood. Yes. Daniel Price held out his hand. I knew your grandmother. Those 4 words nearly broke her, not because they explained anything, because they made Alma feel less gone. Daniel led her into his office, where law books lined one wall and framed mountain photographs hung behind the desk. He did not rush her. He did not talk over her. He waited while Helen placed both folders in front of him. This one is from my husband, Helen said. She stopped, then corrected herself. My ex-husband. Daniel noticed the correction but said nothing. And this one, Helen continued, touching the older folder, was hidden in my grandmother's cabin. Daniel's fingers paused on the string. You found the cabin. Helen looked at him. The family told me it was sold. Daniel was quiet for a long second. Then he said, No, Mom, it was not. The room seemed to narrow. Helen gripped the edge of her chair. Daniel untied the folder and began reading. At first his face remained careful, professional, calm. Then he reached the deed. His eyes slowed. He turned to the next page, then back again. He picked up the tax receipts, checked the dates, read the ledger. By the time he opened the plastic sleeve, the kindness in his face had sharpened into concern. Helen, he said, I don't want to get ahead of the documents. We need certified copies from the county. We need to verify the trust records. But this does not look like a mistake. Helen swallowed. What does it look like? Daniel tapped the deed gently. It looks like your grandmother made sure that cabin could not be taken from you easily. Helen stared at the paper. The words should have comforted her. Instead, they frightened her. Because if Alma had protected the cabin, then someone else had hidden that protection. Daniel reached for Frank's folder. May I? Helen nodded. He opened it. The pages were newer, cleaner, more aggressive. Daniel read silently. One page, then another. Then his jaw tightened. Helen saw the change. It was small but clear. What is it? She asked. Daniel did not answer right away. He turned one page toward her and pointed to a paragraph near the middle. "This section," he said, "is very broad." Helen leaned closer. The words looked cold and crowded. Waiver, release, known and unknown claims, inheritance rights, separate property, trust interests. She looked up. "I don't understand." Daniel's voice stayed gentle. "That is why it worries me." Helen's fingers went cold. He explained it slowly, not like Frank, who used confusion as a wall. Daniel used simple words. If Helen signed, she might give up rights connected to property, inheritance, or assets she had not fully discovered yet. Not just what Frank had listed. Unknown claims, too. Unknown. The word sat between them. Helen thought of the scratched lock, the hidden envelope, the deed, the tax receipt dated 8 months ago. Frank saying sign before Friday. She pressed one hand against her chest. "Are you saying he knew?" Daniel leaned back. "I am saying this language was not careless." Outside the window, a delivery truck passed, rattling over the street. Inside the office, Helen felt something inside her life shift again. Not loudly. Permanently, Daniel placed Frank's folder beside Alma's. "Until we know more, you sign nothing." Helen nodded. For once, she did not feel ashamed for needing help. She felt ashamed, only that she had almost believed Frank's hurry was normal. Daniel opened Alma's envelope again and removed a smaller slip of paper Helen had missed. It had been tucked behind the flap. His eyes narrowed as he read it. Then he looked at Helen. "Your grandmother mentioned a bank." Helen sat straighter. "A bank?" Daniel turned the slip toward her. There was an old account number, a box number, and one sentence in Alma's handwriting. "If Helen is sitting with you, Daniel, then Frank has finally made his move." Helen felt the blood leave her face, because Grandma Alma had not only expected trouble, she had named it. The bank sat 3 blocks from Daniel Price's office, a plain stone building on the corner of State Street with a green awning over the door and a flag moving slowly in the cold morning wind. Helen had passed it many times in younger years. She had walked by with grocery bags, driven past it on the way to church suppers, waited at the stoplight box beside it without once imagining that something inside might carry her name. Now she stood outside with Daniel Price beside her, and Grandma Alma's slip of paper folded in her hand. The paper felt thin, almost fragile, but the sentence on it had weight. "If Helen is sitting with you, Daniel, then Frank has finally made his move." Helen had read it 3 times in the car. Each time the words felt less like a warning and more like Alma reaching across the years to put a steady hand on her back. Daniel opened the bank door. Warm air moved over them. Inside, everything was polished and quiet. Marble floor, brass lamps, soft voices behind glass, a bowl of peppermints on the counter. Helen noticed the little things because her mind needed somewhere to rest. If she looked too long at the truth, she feared she might come apart. A young teller smiled at them. Daniel gave his name and asked to speak with a manager about an old safe deposit box. The teller's smile tightened. Old records made people careful. A few minutes later, a woman in a gray blazer came out and introduced herself as Patricia Cole. She looked at Daniel first, then at Helen. "How can I help you?" Daniel placed Alma's slip on the desk between them. "We're trying to locate a safe deposit box connected to Alma Reed." Patricia typed the name into her computer. Her fingers moved quickly, then slowed. "I'm not seeing an active box under that name." Helen's stomach dropped. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt backward. Maybe the trail ended here. Maybe the drawer had held hopes and nothing more. Maybe Frank would still win because time had swallowed whatever Alma tried to protect. Daniel did not move. "Try the account number." Patricia looked again at the slip, typed carefully, waited. Her expression changed. Not much, but Helen saw it. The professional distance gave way to attention. "There is an archived record," Patricia said. She read silently, then looked at Helen. "May I see your identification?" Helen opened her purse with unsteady hands and took out her driver's license. Patricia studied it, then the screen, then the license again. "Mrs. Brooks," she said slowly, "your name is listed here." Helen did not speak. Daniel leaned forward. "In what capacity?" Patricia lowered her voice. "Authorized access. Sole authorized access after Alma Reed's death." The words entered Helen quietly, not like thunder, like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside her. Sole authorized access. For years she had been told the cabin was gone. For years, Frank had handled the papers. For years, Helen had believed she owned nothing old enough to remember her, and yet, here in a bank she had passed without thinking. Alma had left a box that only Helen could open. Patricia asked Helen to sign a form. Helen stared at the pen, her hand hesitated. Daniel noticed. "This one is safe," he said gently. "It only confirms access to the box." Helen nodded. But the hesitation mattered. Frank had made even signing her name feel dangerous. She wrote carefully. Helen Marie Brooks. The bank manager led them down a short hallway to a private room. A few minutes later, she returned with a long metal box. Gray, scratched, heavier than it looked. She placed it on the table and left them alone. Helen sat across from it. Daniel remained standing near the door, giving her space. "This is yours to open," he said. Helen lifted the lid. Inside were folders wrapped in cream-colored cloth, a small envelope of photographs, and a thick packet sealed with red string. On top lay a letter. Her name was written across it. Not Helen Marie Brooks this time. Just, "My Helen." That was when her eyes filled. Not because of the property. Not because of the money she did not yet understand. Because no one had called her that in years. Not like she belonged to love. Not like she was more than a problem to solve. Helen opened the letter first. Alma's handwriting was weaker here than on the earlier note. The letters leaned. Some words shook, but the meaning was steady. "My Helen, if you are reading this, then you came back later than I hoped. But not too late." Helen pressed the paper against the table so her hand would not tremble too much. Alma wrote that she had watched Frank from the beginning. She had seen the little corrections, the money conversations Helen was pushed out of. The way Frank made generosity look like control. Alma admitted she could not force Helen to see what love had hidden from her, so she did the only thing she could do. She protected a place, not a fortune first, not a prize, a place, a roof, a road, a door Helen could open when every other door closed. Daniel carefully opened the packet while Helen read. Inside were certified trust documents, a copy of the cabin deed, property tax receipts, a land survey, records showing payments made through Alma's trust account, and Helen's name appeared again and again: beneficiary, successor, trustee, authorized party, protected interest. The words were legal, cold on the page, but to Helen they felt like warm hands pulling her out of deep water. She touched each document as Daniel explained it, slowly, plainly. The cabin had not been sold. The land around it had been held in trust. Alma had arranged for taxes to be paid from a small account, and Helen had been named years earlier. Before Frank's divorce folder, before the suitcase, before that night at the door. Alma had made her move first. Then Helen found a photograph in the envelope. It showed Alma standing on the cabin porch, one hand resting on the railing, the other holding the same brass key. Behind the photo, Alma had written, "He will look for value. You look for truth." Helen turned the photograph over and read the line twice. Daniel's face grew serious. "There's something else," he said. He lifted the land survey. A corner of the page had been marked in red pencil. Not by Alma. The mark was newer. Daniel held it closer to the light. Beside the marked boundary line was a name Helen recognized. Not Frank's, but close enough to make her heart tighten. Calvin Brooks Development Group. Frank's younger brother. Helen stared at the paper. The cabin had not just been kept from her. Someone in Frank's family had been studying it. And suddenly, the scratches around the lock no longer felt like a mystery from the past. They felt like a warning from last week. Helen did not speak for several seconds. She only stared at the name on the survey. Calvin Brooks Development Group, Frank's brother. Not a stranger. Not some distant company with no face. Family. The kind that smiled across Thanksgiving tables, asked for extra gravy, and called Helen sweetheart when they wanted her quiet. Daniel Price laid the survey flat on the bank table. His finger rested near the red pencil mark. "This boundary line," he said, "runs along the lower part of your grandmother's land." Helen looked at the map. Thin black lines. Numbers. A creek marked in blue. A dirt road curling toward the cabin. It should have looked ordinary, but now it felt like someone had drawn a target around the only place left to her.
"What does Calvin want with it?"
Helen asked. Daniel's expression stayed careful. "I don't know yet." That word mattered.
Yet.
Helen folded Alma's letter with both hands, slow enough not to tear it. On the back of the photograph, Alma's warning seemed to burn through the paper. He will look for value. You look for truth. Helen understood now. Frank and Calvin saw land. Alma saw shelter. Frank saw paperwork. Alma saw Helen. Frank saw something to take. Alma saw someone worth protecting. Daniel gathered the documents and placed them back in order. We need certified copies, he said. County records, trust records, any correspondence tied to Calvin's company. Helen nodded, but her mind had already gone back to the cabin, to the scratches around the lock, to the bucket under the leak, to the ashes in the fireplace, to the feeling that the cabin had not been empty for a long time. Daniel, she said quietly, if Calvin's company marked that survey, could someone have gone inside? Daniel looked at her. Possibly. The word landed hard. Helen did not feel faint this time. She felt still. That was different. Stillness had begun to replace panic, not because she was unafraid, because fear was no longer the only thing inside her. After they left the bank, Daniel made 2 copies of everything he legally could and locked the originals in his office safe. Then he told Helen to go back to the cabin only if she felt safe. Helen almost smiled. Safe had become a strange word. Frank's house had looked safe from the street. Warm windows, trimmed shrubs, a porch wreath in winter. But safety was not the same as appearance. The cabin looked lonely, yet it had kept her name hidden better than any house Frank ever owned. By late afternoon, Helen drove back up the mountain road. This time, she noticed what she had missed in the dark. Fresh tire marks near the muddy entrance. Branches snapped along the narrow track. A patch of grass pressed flat beside the porch. Her hands tightened on the wheel. Someone had been there. She parked farther from the cabin than before and sat for a moment with the engine off. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No passing cars. Just wind moving through bare branches. Helen took Alma's key from her coat pocket and stepped out. The front door was still closed. The scratches around the lock looked sharper in daylight. She did not go in right away. Instead, she walked around the porch. One board near the railing had been loosened, not lifted, just disturbed. Helen knelt slowly. There was mud on the edge, a boot print too large to be hers. She stood and looked through the front window. The covered sofa, the cold fireplace, the writing desk, everything appeared still. But now she knew stillness could lie. Helen unlocked the door and entered. She kept it open behind her. The cabin smelled the same. Dust, cedar, damp wood. But something had shifted. Not a chair, not a drawer, something smaller, a space on the wall. Helen turned toward it. Above the writing desk hung the old porch photograph she had noticed before. Alma and Helen, summer light. One hand on the railing, Helen at 16 laughing at something outside the frame. But the picture was crooked, just slightly. Helen walked closer. Her pulse began to rise. Alma had never hung anything crooked. Helen lifted the frame from the nail. The back felt loose. One metal tab had been bent outward. Someone had checked it, maybe recently, maybe in a hurry. Helen turned the frame over on the desk and folded back the paper backing. A thin envelope slipped out. It was not yellowed like the others. This one was newer, white, sealed. And across the front, in handwriting Helen did not recognize, were 3 words, "For Calvin only." Helen stared at it. Then the floorboard creaked behind her, not from the wind, not from the house settling. From the porch, someone was outside the open door. Helen did not turn around right away. The white envelope stayed in her hand. For Calvin only. Those 3 words had already changed the room. Then the porch board creaked again, slow, heavy, deliberate. Helen placed the envelope flat on Alma's writing desk and rested one hand over it, not to hide it well, just to keep herself from shaking. The open door let in a strip of cold afternoon light. A shadow crossed it. Then Frank Brooks stepped into view. He did not enter at first. He stood outside the doorway with one hand on the porch post, dressed in his gray coat, his hair combed, his expression arranged into concern. The same expression he used at church when someone said Helen looked tired. "Helen," he said, "what are you doing out here alone?" Alone. The word almost made her laugh. He had thrown her out. Then followed her to ask why she was by herself. Helen turned slowly. She did not answer his question. Frank looked past her into the cabin. His eyes moved too quickly. The desk, the wall, the open drawer, the papers stacked near Helen's elbow. He saw more than he wanted her to know. I was worried, he said. No warmth lived in it, only inspection. Helen folded her hands in front of her. You came all this way because you were worried? Frank stepped inside then. Just one step, enough to claim space. Not enough to seem threatening if anyone asked later. You're upset, he said. That's understandable. But running off to an old cabin, digging through things you don't understand. That's not helping anyone. There it was, the old shape of him, concern used as a fence. Helen looked at the floor. There was mud on his shoe, dark red clay, the same color as the boot print near the porch railing. Her heart tightened, but her voice stayed even. How did you know I was here? Frank paused, only half a second, long enough. You used to talk about this place, he said. Helen nodded once. That was not an answer. Frank moved his gaze to the desk again. What exactly did you find? The question entered the cabin like a dropped match. Helen heard Alma's warning in her mind. Before you sign anything, she also heard Daniel Price. You sign nothing. Helen walked to the desk and placed her palm fully over the white envelope. I found enough to know I need a lawyer. Frank's face changed. Not much. But Helen had spent 30 years studying small changes in that face, the slight tightening near his mouth, the colder focus in his eyes. The concern disappeared. Daniel Price? He asked. Helen did not respond. That silence answered him anyway. Frank exhaled through his nose. Helen, that man will fill your head with nonsense. He always had too much respect for Alma's grudges. Alma's grudges. Helen felt the word strike something deep. Even dead, Alma was being dismissed. Even now, Frank wanted to make her protection sound like bitterness. Helen lifted her chin. Grandma Alma protected what was hers. Frank's smile was thin. And now you think it's yours. He meant to make the question sound foolish, but it landed differently inside Helen. Because for the first time, she was not sure he was asking. She was sure he was afraid. Frank stepped closer. Helen did not move back. The cabin seemed to hold its breath around them. He lowered his voice. Listen carefully. Legal fights are expensive. You don't have money for this. You don't have the stomach for it. And when people hear you're trying to take family property over some old papers, they won't see you as brave. He leaned slightly toward her. They'll see you as confused. That word was meant to finish what the suitcase began. To make her old. To make her small. To make her doubt the proof lying under her hand. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Then she remembered the bank manager saying her name with respect. Daniel reading the documents slowly. Alma writing, my Helen. The old spell cracked. I am done signing things I don't understand, Helen said. Frank's eyes hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Helen said. I made one for 30 years. The room went silent. Even Frank seemed surprised, not by the words alone, by the steadiness in them. He glanced once more at the desk, at Helen's hand, at the envelope beneath it. Then he backed toward the door. This will get ugly, he said. Helen walked to the door before he could turn that warning into another threat. She held it open. Frank stared at her. For the first time in their marriage, he was standing outside a door she controlled. Helen did not slam it. She simply closed it. The latch clicked, a small sound, but it felt bigger than shouting. Outside, Frank's truck started after a long pause. Gravel cracked beneath the tires. Then the sound faded down the road. Helen stood still until the woods were quiet again. Only then did she return to the desk. Her hands were no longer steady, but they were working. She picked up the white envelope. For Calvin only. The seal had already been broken once. Helen opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, a short note, no signature, just a date from 3 weeks earlier and one sentence that made the cabin feel colder than before. Frank says she'll sign before she ever knows the land is hers. The note did not need many words to destroy the last excuse Helen had made for Frank. Frank says she'll sign before she ever knows the land is hers. Helen read it once, then again. The page was plain. No letterhead, no signature, just a date from 3 weeks earlier and a sentence sharp enough to cut through 30 years of doubt. For a long moment, Helen stood at Alma's writing desk and listened to the cabin settle around her. The walls creaked softly. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the porch. Somewhere outside, a crow called once from the trees. Helen placed the note beside Alma's letter. 2 messages, 2 kinds of truth. Alma had written to protect her. Frank had written around her, as if she were already beaten. Helen did not cry. That surprised her. The hurt was there, deep, heavy, but tears did not come. Something else came instead. Clarity. Frank had not made a mistake. He had made a plan. And now that Helen had seen it, he would need another one. It came before sunset. The first call was from Frank's daughter, Lisa. Helen had helped raise Lisa from the age of 9. She had packed her lunches, driven her to dentist appointments, hemmed prom dresses, and sat beside her bed through a fever that lasted 3 days. Now Lisa's voice came through the phone, stiff and careful. "Dad says you're making this harder than it needs to be." Helen closed her eyes, not from weakness, from disappointment. "Did he tell you he put my suitcase by the door?" Lisa was quiet. Then she said, "He said things had been tense." Tense. Helen looked at the cold fireplace. "Tense is when two people argue," she said. "This was different." Lisa sighed. "Please don't turn everyone against each other over some old cabin." Helen looked at Alma's papers spread across the desk. Some old cabin. That was how Frank wanted them to say it. Not home, not inheritance, not proof, just some old cabin. By nightfall, 2 more calls came. A cousin who had not visited Helen in years said Frank was embarrassed. A church friend said she hoped Helen would not drag private matters through town. One person even suggested that at Helen's age, peace mattered more than property. Helen listened. She did not shout. She did not defend every detail. She only noticed the pattern. No one asked where she had slept the night Frank put her out. No one asked why he needed her signature before Friday. No one asked why a supposedly sold cabin still had her name buried in its papers. They asked only why Helen was not making things easier for Frank. That night she sat at Alma's kitchen table with her coat still on. The cabin was cold, but not as cold as the calls. Her phone lit up again. This time it was a number she did not recognize. Helen almost ignored it. Then she answered. A woman's voice came through, low and rough with age. "Helen Brooks? Yes, my name is Grace Miller. I live down the road from Alma's place. Or I used to, before my knees got bad." Helen sat straighter. Grace did not waste time. "I saw Frank up there." Helen's hand tightened around the phone. "When? About 3 months ago, maybe less. He came with another man, younger, fancy boots, clipboard, survey maps." Helen stopped breathing for a second. "Calvin?" Grace paused. "Could've been. Didn't get close enough to hear. But I know Frank, and I know the look of men measuring land they don't own." The words settled into the room. "Measuring land they don't own," Grace continued. "I called because Alma was good to me. Years ago, when my husband died, she brought soup every Friday for 6 weeks. Never made a show of it, just left it warm on the porch." Helen swallowed. That sounded like Alma. Grace's voice softened. "She told me once, if my Helen ever comes back here looking scared, don't let anybody tell her she's crazy." Helen pressed a hand over her mouth. This time, the tears almost came. Not because she was breaking. Because Alma's protection had reached farther than she knew. Grace gave Helen one more piece. There was a white pickup behind Frank's truck that day. Had a company decal on the door. Brooks Development. Helen wrote it down. Her hand shook, but the letters were clear. The next morning, Helen drove to Daniel Price's office before it opened. He was already there. The lights were on. Coffee steamed on his desk. He took one look at her face and reached for a legal pad. Helen handed him the note from the envelope. Then she told him about Grace. Daniel read the note twice. His expression hardened in a way Helen had not seen before. "This gives us a timeline," he said. He laid the papers out carefully. The land survey, the note dated 3 weeks earlier, the divorce folder, the waiver language, Grace's statement, the bank documents, the trust. Piece by piece, the shape of Frank's plan appeared. He had learned the land belonged to Helen. He had learned it had value. He had pushed divorce papers with broad waiver language. He had tried to get her signature before she understood the truth. Daniel looked up. "Helen, we need to prepare for a meeting." With Frank and his attorney. Helen looked down at her hands. For 30 years, those hands had cooked, cleaned, carried, soothed, stitched, and stayed. Now they rested on proof. She expected fear to rise. It did, but it did not rise alone. Beside it came something steadier, a quiet voice that sounded almost like Alma. "Know where your own key is." Helen lifted her eyes. "When?" Daniel's answer was calm. "Tomorrow morning." Outside his office window, Black Mountain moved on like any ordinary day. Cars passed, a dog barked, someone laughed near the bakery. But inside that room, Helen understood that tomorrow would not be ordinary. Frank had told the story first. Now Helen was bringing the truth. The next morning, Helen Brooks arrived at Daniel Price's office 15 minutes early. She wore the same navy coat she had worn the night Frank put her out. But she did not look like the same woman. Her hair was pinned back, her shoes were clean, her hands rested around Grandma Alma's brass key, and beside her chair sat a brown folder thick with papers Frank had never expected her to read. Daniel did not tell her to be brave. He knew better. Bravery was not always loud. Sometimes it looked like an older woman sitting quietly in a law office, with proof in her lap and fear under control. Daniel placed a legal pad in front of him, then he said, "Let the documents speak first." Helen nodded. At 10 o'clock, Frank walked in with his attorney. Frank's coat was pressed. His shoes were polished. His face carried the tired patience of a man who expected sympathy before facts. He glanced at Helen, then at Daniel, then at the folder on the table, a small pause, barely there. But Helen saw it. For 30 years she had studied Frank's pauses. This one had fear inside it. His attorney opened smoothly. "We're hoping to settle this without unnecessary conflict." Helen looked down at her hands. Unnecessary conflict. That was what people called it when a woman refused to vanish politely. Daniel's voice stayed calm. "We want resolution too," he said. "But first, we need to correct the record." Frank leaned back, as if bored. As if this was another room he could control by looking patient. Daniel opened Alma's folder. He did not rush. That mattered. One paper at a time, he placed the truth on the table. The certified deed, the trust documents, the county tax receipts, the safe deposit authorization, the land survey, Grace Miller's statement, the note from behind the cabin photograph, then Frank's divorce papers. The room changed as each page landed, not dramatically, quietly, like a door being locked from the inside. Daniel turned to Frank's attorney. "Your client asked Mrs. Brooks to waive known and unknown claims, including inheritance rights, separate property interests, and trust-related interests." Frank's attorney glanced at the page, then at Frank. Daniel continued. "Those papers were prepared after inquiries were made into land connected to Alma Reed's trust. Land where Mrs. Brooks is the protected beneficiary." The attorney stopped writing. That was the first real crack. Helen saw Frank's jaw tighten. The attorney lifted the survey and studied the red pencil mark. Then he looked at Frank again. "Did you know about this property?" Frank gave a small laugh. It was the same laugh he had used for years when Helen asked questions, a laugh designed to make the question feel embarrassing. "This is absurd," he said. "Helen finds old papers in a rotting cabin, and now everyone's pretending there's some grand plot." Helen felt the old pull, the old urge to look down, to let his certainty become bigger than her own. But Alma's key pressed into her palm, small, cold, real. Daniel slid the white note across the table. No speech, no accusation, just the page. Frank looked down. His face changed before he could stop it. His attorney picked up the note and read it, slowly. "Frank says she'll sign before she ever knows the land is hers." Silence filled the office. Outside, traffic moved along State Street. A dog barked somewhere near the sidewalk. Inside, 30 years of control sat exposed in one sentence. Frank's attorney lowered the note. His voice was different now, careful. "Frank, what is this?" Frank looked at Helen. Not sorry, not ashamed, angry, as if the betrayal was not what he had done, but that she had found it. Helen had imagined this moment would break her open. She thought she might cry. She thought she might ask why. But sitting across from him, she finally understood something painful and freeing. "Some people do not need your pain," explained. They watched it happen while they benefited from it. So Helen gave him only the truth. "You threw me out of one house," she said, "because you were trying to steal the only home my grandmother left me." Frank opened his mouth. No polished sentence came. Daniel continued from there. The waiver would not be signed. All communication would go through counsel. The trust would be formally confirmed. The county records would be secured. Grace Miller's statement would be preserved. And Calvin Brooks' development group would be required to answer why it had marked land it did not own. Frank's attorney closed his folder. The meeting ended without a handshake. At the door, Frank turned back. His face was hard. "You think this makes you safe?" Helen looked at him, then at Alma's key. "No," she said softly. "It makes me awake." Frank left, and the room seemed to breathe after him. Helen sat still. Her hands were shaking now, but not from weakness, from release. In the weeks that followed, the truth moved slowly, the way legal truth often does. Not like lightning, like water finding every hidden crack. The trust was confirmed. The cabin belonged to Helen. The surrounding land was protected. Frank's rushed papers lost their power. Calvin's company backed away when Daniel requested records, and the people who had called Helen confused grew quiet. Some never apologized. That hurt, but it no longer ruled her. Lisa called one evening. Her voice was softer than before. "I didn't know," she said. Helen believed her, but belief did not erase the wound. "You chose the easier story," Helen said gently. "Next time, ask where someone slept." There was silence on the line, then Lisa cried. Helen did not comfort her too quickly. Some lessons needed room. Spring came slowly to the Blue Ridge Mountains. By April, the cabin roof was repaired. By May, the porch no longer sagged. By June, lavender grew beside the steps because Alma had loved the smell. Helen kept the quilt on the bed, not hidden away, used, warm, alive. Some evenings, she sat at Alma's writing desk and read the letters again. Not because she needed proof, because love had a voice there. Ink could not hug her, but it could still hold her steady. One afternoon, Daniel brought the final certified packet to the cabin. Helen opened it at the kitchen table. Her name was there, on the deed, on the trust, on the land records, on the documents Frank wanted her to surrender before she ever knew they existed. Helen Marie Brooks. For years, Frank had treated her name like something useful only when he needed a signature. But Alma had used that same name to build a doorway back to freedom. Helen stepped onto the porch as evening settled over the mountains. The creek moved below the hill. The trees shifted in the wind. The road that had carried her there, broken now, looked like the road that had brought her home. In the beginning, Helen stood beside a suitcase, while Frank told her she had nowhere else to go. Now she stood with Grandma Alma's key in her hand, and the one thing Frank never wanted her to have. Proof. Not just proof of ownership, proof that she had mattered all along. Maybe that is why Helen's story stays with us, because there are people who call you difficult the moment you stop being easy to control. They mistake patience for weakness, silence for surrender, kindness for permission. But Helen Brooks proved something different. A woman can be pushed out of one life and still find the door to the one that was meant for her. So if Helen's story moved you, like this video and subscribe before the next story begins. Because people like Helen are erased every day, and the least we can do is keep watching when they finally rise. Now tell me in the comments, should Helen forgive Lisa because Frank misled her? Or should Lisa earn that trust back, one honest action at a time? I read every comment. Thank you for watching.